Hey Brian, and whoever else is watching this, I did my senior seminar project on the eastern white pine, and I did an analysis of its role in the eastern Appalachian ecosystem and the cultural importance it has to indigenous communities, as well as the uncertain future that it faces. For my research question, I wanted to know what role the eastern white pine plays in the Appalachian ecosystem as a cultural keystone species for indigenous communities, and how will its uncertain future impact these systems. And it's important to sustainable development because without these ecosystems, our forests will change. The economies that um, count on it will be threatened, and indigenous communities will be hurt as these ecosystems are key to their way of life, spirituality, and livelihoods. And we can see the effects of these losses through historical examples like the American chestnut, which drastically changed forest ecosystems and the way that we raised animals in the US and the economies of the native ranges. So for my approach, I used two different lenses, and the first was scientific research. And I used a variety of published scientific research to see a better understanding of the function of the eastern white pine in the Appalachian ecosystem. And first, I looked at the benefits of the eastern white pine to the ecosystem, and it was important to get an understanding of that so I could begin to think about the ecological effects that the threats of the species would have on the ecosystem. And then I looked at the problems that it's encountering now. And it was important to get the research on this so that I can address solutions to these problems. And for this, I used a study by the University of Georgia's forestry program and the U.S. Forest Service that occurred from 2011 to 2014. And it conducted a test on 40 different sites in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Virginia um, to see like, where the issues were occurring and what issues they were. And then I also focused on the problems that it'll counter as a result of climate change. And those are important because our climate is slowly changing as a result of climate change, and these changes are inevitable. So for any research done on forests, this is a really important factor because the effects will change how the forest works and stuff. And I used published research called an essay called The Response of Eastern White Pine and Associated Foliar, Blister Rust, Canker, and Root Rot Pathogens to Climate Change. And that really described a lot of the changes that the forest would undergo. And some of them include, as the climate continues to change, understanding how these variations in environmental conditions influence pathogen migration incidence and severity is very important. And the task is particularly complex in natural forest settings because of the long-lived nature of trees and the relatively short regeneration time of pathogens, which then provides pathogens the ability to a faster genetic response and adapt quicker to new climate conditions. And these changes in climate have been shown to directly affect forest pathogens' ability to persist in the ecosystem through increased growth, increased rates of dispersal, expanded geographic ranges, and increased overwintering survival. And then I also looked at the historical examples of American chestnut and eastern hemlock, which were two very widespread species in this region that have both experienced much of the same problems. And we can use these keystone species to see the effects that these losses have on the ecosystems, as well as the communities that depend on them. And then I also looked at through three different theoretical lenses. And in order for this to tie this scientific research into my research question, I used these theoretical lenses. And the first was the idea of cultural keystone species. So for this, I explored this concept by using Anne Garibaldi and Nancy Turner's published paper, Cultural Keystone Species, Implications for Ecological Conservation and Restoration. And it introduced me to the concept and provided me with a lens to view the importance of this species to indigenous communities. And a cultural keystone species is defined as a species that shapes in a major way the cultural identity of a people as reflected in the fundamental roles these species have in diet, materials, medicine, and or spiritual practices for the people. And it also provides a framework for assessing the impacts of environmental change on a particular group of people and their way of life. I also used a published paper titled Cultural Importance of White Pine to the Kitsisakik Algonquin community of Western Quebec, Canada, and it gave me a lot of insight and evidence of the importance that this species carries to Indigenous groups. And then next, I also looked at cultural landscapes, and which are important in recognizing the relationships between Indigenous groups and the environment. And I found that Aboriginal communities living in or close to forested areas view their surrounding landscape as a cultural entity. Forests are sacred for them and are considered an integral part of their collective identity and culture. I also looked at the idea of, or the concept of the land ethic, which was coined by Aldo Leopold in the 1950s, as another lens to view Native Americans' relationship with the land. And also, I think it's a great way to start thinking of solutions to our society's toxic relationship with the environment that has caused a lot of these problems. And while traditional American society abuses land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us, the land ethic instead sees land as a community to which we belong. And if we think about it that way, we can begin to use it with love and respect, which is what Indigenous communities have been doing for so long. And by doing this, we can see the value of the land in a philosophical sense rather than economics, which our current system of capitalism pushes us to do. And through viewing this species and its ecosystem through this lens, we can understand the vitality of the species for our landscapes and the intrinsic values that it carries. Too far. So for some outcomes, I learned a lot more about Indigenous communities and the way that they've used this species, such as like the various medicinal uses, their use of it as a food source in desperate times, such as like taking the cambium, which is the inner layer of the bark, and pounding it down into a flour and adding that to traditional flour to make bread with and to stretch that resource. And it's also very important to their way of life and their spirituality. I also increased my knowledge on Appalachian ecosystems and learned a lot about how different species benefit from this tree and how everything really is tied together. And I also discovered the importance of cultural keystone species, which is a concept I really hadn't heard much, because generally in most of my sustainable development classes, I've heard about keystone species to ecosystems rather to cultures. And then I ended up doing a drawing. I was originally going to participate in a timber frame workshop in Nashville, Tennessee, and maybe do some interviews with community members there, but that got canceled because of coronavirus. So I wasn't able to go to that in November. And then I was over Thanksgiving break, I was going to, we have a lot of pine tree or eastern white pine on our property at home. So I was going to sustainably like cut one down and mill it and build something out of it. But I got sick and wasn't even able to go home for Thanksgiving break. So I wasn't able to do that. So while I was sick, I was able to do this drawing instead, which I thought would be a cool addition to the project. And this drawing is of representing the Iroquois story of this tree species and the creation of the League of Nations. And to these people, they refer to the eastern white pine as the tree of great peace. And on the trunk of the tree, I drew one of the Native American symbols for peace and prosperity. I drew roots to symbolize the tribes and the roots reaching out to extend peace to other tribes, like was told in the story. And then I drew the roots tangled in weapons to represent how, in the story, the 5 tribes threw their weapons into an area under the tree to accept a peace. And on the top of the tree, I drew a bald eagle who in the story sits on top of the tree. And if any evil approaches the league, it would scream out an alarm. I mean, I really felt like this story spoke to the importance of the species for the Iroquois culture and why it can be regarded as a cultural keystone species. And so some challenges that I faced in this project was obviously the hands-on project that I just talked about, just stuff coming up with getting sick, and then that conference that I was going to attend getting canceled. And then I also had some trouble integrating both scientific and theoretical lenses, just because at the beginning of my paper, a lot of it was very scientific and talking about all the issues that the species faces. So it's kind of hard to transition between writing super like scientifically for that and using all that scientific research to then thinking about it theoretically and using the different lenses of like the land ethic and cultural landscapes and that stuff to think about it. But I thought it was really cool once I was able to do that to see how they tie together. And so for like a professional lesson, I really found that I was interested in the relationships between ecology and cultures. And I definitely wish I would have taken some more classes in college on ecology, just because I thought it was really interesting. And I'm very interested in forestry, so I think that would have benefited me in the long term. But it is what it is. So thank you.